All right, in the last video, we started to talk about how, well, we looked at fractional reserve banking. We kind of walked through a more realistic, real world example where um, people put money into the bank and that money was then split into required reserves and excess reserves. And those excess reserves, were it's a liability, right? That money in the bank's a liability, but that excess reserve now is an asset the bank can use to loan out to people and make interest and build profit for themselves. But now we're starting to look at is that what we're doing is, in a weird way, increasing the money supply because this $1 million still exists for that person who put that $1 million in the bank. But now there's another $900,000 that can be used. The first person looks at that and says, I have $1 million in the bank. And the bank then gives $900,000 of it away as a loan. That person doesn't know anything. So, are the banks creating money? Well, yes and no. Money supply is growing. M1 is increasing, but we're not actually making new currency. Not yet. Okay, that we'll talk about later on. The Federal Reserve controls a lot of that today. But no new currency is being printed, but the money supply is increasing. And this is why we have a difference between M1 and M0. We'll talk about that in a second. So let's take a look at this. This is an example from the textbook. So first step, this is a simplified model of how this is actually working out, all right, and how this money supply is increasing. Um, so first step, we only have a few people in this economy. A few people exist, and there's only $1,000 that exist in the beginning. So just assume that there's only $1,000 that exists in this entire world. $1,000 of transactional funds, and that's all that exists. And it's all owned by one person named Silas. So first step, ignore the rest right now. Silas keeps all his cash under his bed. So there's $1,000 out in circulation. I mean, it's under his bed right now, but it's existing in circulation. So he's got $1,000. There's no checkable bank deposits, right? So there's nothing in the bank. No bank has any money right now. It's just the bank of his bed, and he's got $1,000 out there. The money supply that exists in the world right now is $1,000. That's all that exists, and that's it. All right. So next step. Silas is getting a little worried. He's worried his house is going to burn down or something, and he wants a little bit more security. So he goes to First Street Bank. All right, and he takes his $1,000 out from underneath his bed, and he goes to First Street Bank, and he puts all of his money in the bank. So now there's $1,000 of checkable deposits, and the bank gives him a little book or website access today nowadays, and says here you can log on here and look at your bank account anytime you want. And he goes and does that, and he sees that he has $1,000 in the bank, and he can sleep easier at night. So he knows that that bank with its big vaults and marble columns is keeping his money safe. So Silas is happy with his bank and says $1,000 in his checking account. But the bank then takes $900, right? They're reserving 10%, but they are taking $900 and they are going to loan it out to other people now. The bank is taking his money to protect it, but they're not doing it because they love him. They're doing it to make profit. And how they're going to do this? Well, they're going to say, okay, Silas is putting his money here as to keep it safe and safekeeping. We're going to take $900 then and loan it out so that people can do whatever else with that money, and we'll charge interest on people who borrow this $900. So the First Street Bank lends $900 to Mary. Mary needed money for something. She had to pay it back to Anne for some reason, but Mary needed cash, and so Mary goes to the bank and gets a $900 loan. And she's going to agree to pay interest on it and everything. So Mary gets a $900 loan, which is actually Silas's money, right? And then she pays it to Anne. So let's take a look at what's happened now. There's $1,000 in checkable deposits. That's a liability the bank has, and that's Silas's $1,000. But the understanding is that he's not going to go grab it out right now. And that $900 now is also in circulation because, that $900 exists for Mary, who then gave it to Anne, right? So there's that $1,000 is still there. If you look at the books, there's $1,000 still there. But now there's also a $900 loan that's also out there as well, too. In a weird way now, the money supply is $1,900. Now, you're probably saying, no, it's not. I mean, there's not 1,900 hard currency dollars. And you're right. There are not, right? There's still that $1,000. However, this is how the financial world works. This is how banks work. This money is here, but the understanding is that Silas is going to leave that money there, and that his money is going to be put to work by the bank. All right? And so while they're doing this, the money supply will start to increase, and we're going to see the next step here. So the money supply, the availability of money is increasing. No hard currency is being printed yet. All right, no new currency is being printed, but the availability of money is increasing, and that's what M1 basically is. And I know we're getting a little weirder and a little more abstract, and you're probably seeing that there's some problems here. Um, Hold on, we'll talk about those in a minute. So let's go down to the third step. So Mary has a $900 loan now. She owes First Street Bank $900, and she gave that money to Anne. Well, Anne gets her money now. She gets her $900 that Mary owed her, and she's happy with that. And Anne goes to her bank, Second Street Bank, so we're at a different bank now. Doesn't matter. But she goes to her bank and she deposits her $900. Okay, so what happened? Well, now checkable deposits have increased. Silas's $1,000 is still here, but now Anne has $900 in there. So total checkable deposits in all of the banks, the two banks, all of the banks in the world are $1,900. So there's $1,900 in the bank. At least that's what it looks like on paper. And then the bank goes around and loans out $810. And you might be thinking, $810, that's a weird number. But we mentioned this before. The required reserve of currency in the bank is typically 10%. All right, it can change, but usually 10% is considered the safest minimum. So 10% of that money needs to be reserved. So if she puts in $900 into Second Street Bank, how much does Second Street Bank need to reserve? Well, 10%. So $90 needs to be set aside as required reserves. Meanwhile, Second Street Bank can then go out and lend out $810 of that $900. So now $810 is excess funds available to be loaned out. This is where this example ends, right? But $810 can be loaned out. People can go and get a loan up to $810. Meanwhile, Anne looks at her bank account and says, I have $900 in the bank. Silas looks at his bank account and says, I have $1,000 in the bank. And in a weird way, and Mary's now paying, interest on a loan and stuff like that, and money's going to keep increasing here. But in a weird way, the money supply has now increased. The availability of money, loans or basically loans and deposits, checking deposits, is up to $2,710. Obviously, this could keep going. What if that $810 gets loaned out, and blah 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 blah, blah, and so on and so forth. So wait a second, Mr. Malcolm. You're telling me that the money supply, M1, isn't real hard money? That the bank doesn't have my money? Yeah, that's literally how banks work. That's why M1 is not M0. M0 is sometimes called narrow money, the narrowest definition. Hard money, money that's in banks and money that's in circulation, like money in bank vaults in circulation. M1 is not. M1 is money in circulation, but it's also money that is being created essentially through fractional reserve banking. Through all the checking deposits and all these things. So M1 is more of an abstraction, I guess. But this is how banks work. Banks accept money from people, keep a small portion of it, and then loan out the rest. And in a weird way, that increases the money supply. Because you look at your bank report and you have $1,000, but the reality is the bank has already given some of that money away. Now, this is obviously far simplified example. There's like 3 people and 2 banks. In reality, right, banks have thousands, if not millions of customers. And they, you might not have very much money in the bank, but somebody might have millions of dollars in the bank. And they're 10%, right? They're not going to go out and take all their money out of the bank all the time. But you're probably thinking, look, what if everybody, decided to get their money out of the bank? What if everybody went and decided to claim their, money here? Because Silas has $1,000 in the bank, but he doesn't. They already spent the bank spent $900 of it, right? If Silas goes and asks for $1,000 right now, the bank's not going to have it. So surely this system won't work, right? Yeah, it's had some problems in the past. The system generally works. We'll say that. I mean, for most examples, most of history, it has worked. But you've probably heard of runs on the bank. The Great Depression is a very famous example of this. A few years back, during the financial crisis, there were some runs on the Greek banks. You can look up, and there's some even sadder things. It especially hurts the elderly, people who had retirement savings, and then when the banks collapsed or people lost faith in the banks and started to run and try to get their money out, older people oftentimes suffer the worst. But yeah, no, this is a reality. This can happen. If people lose their faith and they decide to start pulling their money out, remember the bank only keeps that reserve requirement, which usually law is about 10%. that means that only 10% of the money's there. That means that if everybody goes to get it, that money's not there in the bank right now. They're in trouble. So, why do we do this? Well, banks increase the money supply, which helps grow the economy. Banks take money, kind of turn it into more money in a weird way, and they use that money to charge interest and build up and make a profit, and that's how banks work. And then also think about it this way: people can buy houses and start, get small business loans and start companies. So in a weird way, this system, which is kind of precarious and has failed from time to time, actually keeps our economy growing, and makes money more available. Having access to credit is incredibly important for economic growth. If any of your family members own their own small businesses, ask them about that. Having access to credit so that you can buy supplies if you're a contractor to be able to put those things to work, it's incredibly important. So, banks play an important role in our economy. Can they fail? Yes. But today we do have some protections. First of all, we do have reserve requirements. In the original, total laissez-faire banking, we didn't have any reserve requirements. Today we do have some reserve requirements. And we'll talk about it here in a little bit. Most banks actually keep more than the minimal reserve requirement. There are some limitations on what banks can do with investment money. We got rid of this, but if you're curious, after the stock market crash and the bank runs of the Great Depression, we passed the Glass-Steagall Act, which we repealed in 1990, whatever, it's in here somewhere. Whatever, 1999? There we go. Yeah, repealed it in 1999. But the Glass-Steagall Act was an attempt to say, like, hey, maybe banks can't take your money and invest it in the stock market. We wanted to have some divisions then, because remember when the stock market crashed, people lost their money who had invested in the stock market. Well, what if you were a bank? And what if you took, your excess reserves, and rather than giving it out for house loans or business loans, what if you took your excess reserves and put it in the stock market? In the 1920s, the stock market was booming. Well, when the stock market collapsed, a lot of banks lost all the money, and people got wind of that, and that's one of the potential causes for the runs on the banks. Nobody's 100% sure what caused all the bank runs, but that's probably one of the contributing factors. So 1933, I think it was. I really should have read this more closely. Anyways, 1933, I want to say it was. Ah, yeah, here we go. They passed the Glass-Steagall Act to try to prevent some of this stuff. And then we got rid of that in the 90s. Anyways, so there are some limitations, and there's other limitations that existed past that on what banks can do with your money, so it's less likely to lose it. And then finally, we do have Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC insurance. If you go into your bank, you'll probably see a little sticker on the window, or maybe it'll be a little sign by the teller, and it says they are FDIC insured, which means that the deposits in your bank are federally insured up to $250,000 nowadays. So if the bank were to collapse and there were runs on the banks, that your deposits would be safe up to $250,000. Is that reality? I mean, I don't know. If the entire economy collapsed and there were massive bank runs, I don't know if the federal government could pay us back for our deposits, but it is nice and it is something that helps you build up your confidence. So it's building confidence in the banking system. So these are all protections we have to make sure fractional reserve banking doesn't collapse into runs on the bank. All right. Of course, nothing is perfect. All right. So money multiplies. Yeah. Remember the spending multiplier, right? When we looked at MPC and marginal propensity to consume and save. It's similar. It's almost the exact same formula. It's actually simplified. It's even easier. So money multiplies. Yeah. So remember the spending multiplier multiplied GDP. Well, this money multiplier, the money multiplier, will tell us how much the impact of excess reserves, so the fraction, how the bank is splitting money up, how much that excess reserves will have on the money supply. Remember Silas's example there. He had $1,000, but then it kept growing the money supply, right? We said it kept growing the money supply. Well, where's the end of it? Where's the end of it? Once again, if you wanted to apply calculus to it, you can. This comes from calculus, but you don't need calculus for this class. All you need to know is the simple formula. It's money multiplier formula is basically every $1 divided by the reserve ratio. So whatever the reserve ratio is, and that'll tell you the multiplier. I'll give you an example here in a second. So let's take a look. So back to Silas. Assuming banks reserve the minimum of 10%, Silas's $1,000 will increase the money supply to $10,000. So the end result of all of these permutations, all of these money changing hands and banks fractionalizing things and loaning money, assuming that all of this money continually gets deposited, 10% is reserved, 90% is then made excess, and so on and so forth. Which of course is a big assumption. But Silas's $1,000, his original $1,000 deposit, will grow the money supply, the availability of money, M1, it'll grow that by $10,000. Each $1 will turn into $10 of checkable bankable deposits. How does this work in the equation? Well, 1 divided by 0.1, 10%, because the reserve requirement is typically 10%, and that's the example we're using here. It's equal to 10. So the money multiplier is 10. So if I know the money multiplier is 10, this is just like the spending multiplier we did earlier in the course. So if I know that the money multiplier is 10, and I know that he put in $1,000 originally, well, 1,000 times 10 is $10,000. Another way you want to do this, it'll work out as well too. Let me get our friend the calculator here. So if we want to see, well, $1 divided by 0.1 gives us the money multiplier of 10. This is the money multiplier. So if you ever see a question asking for the money multiplier, this is how you do it. 1 divided by the required reserves, and that'll give you the money multiplier. But you could also do it like this. If we say 1,000 divided by 0.1 should give us 10,000 as well too. This is just saying for every $1, what's the growth. So, but now we're just upping that amount. So, but make it simple for yourself. Just make sure you memorize this equation here. Every $1 divided by the reserve requirement will give us the money multiplier. And we take that money multiplier and we multiply it times whatever. So in this example, it was $1,000, so 10 times 1,000. If it was, $5 million, you would do 10 times $5 million. And that's how it works. So money supply, so M1 grows by this amount. And so the end result of all that would be there. All right, so reality check. This is what we said. Every $1 is going to add 10 to the money supply. The reality is, in the real world, most banks, on average, don't keep the very minimum required reserve. All right, banks are a little bit more conservative about their bank reserves. Now, not all are. All right, some banks are wild and they lend out money constantly and even go below 10%. We'll talk about that in a second. But this is just a simplified model where we're trying to learn the concepts of what a money multiplier is and how it could effectively work. And so we're using really simple numbers. So Silas's $1 added 10 to the money supply. In reality, the money multiplier of the United States of America is about 1.19, which is way less than 10, right? Which is way less than 10. We said here the money multiplier was 10. That's about as far away as 10 as you can get. So, or if you want to look at the equation, it's 1 divided by 0.84. So banks hold way more than 10%, right? Being 0.1 to 0.8, way more. Now, this is on average. So some banks keep more than 0.8% and some banks keep less. And some banks actually keep less than 10%. How do they do that? By law, they have to keep the required reserve, right, Mr. Malcolm? You're right, they do. And that means that every night before they close the doors and everything, every night they have to get a loan, oftentimes from another bank, that maintain, so that they have at least 10% of money in their required reserves at night. They take a one-night overnight loan, usually have a fairly low interest rate, and we'll talk about those later, and they take loans from other banks who actually have the reserves, and they keep them up to 10%. Those banks are out there trying to loan out as much money as they can so that they can make as much interest and make as much profit as possible. Of course, that is a little dangerous, but those banks exist to basically get money from other institutions overnight, and they'll charge, they get charged interest. And we'll talk more about that later on. So the actual multiplier is far low, the actual reserve is far more than 10%. The required federal government, the Federal Reserve, is usually 10%. During the 2020 quarantine, they did announce they are dropping it to 0, but we'll see how that plays out. We'll see how that all plays out. So going back to this example, if Silas actually existed in the United States of America and he took his $1,000 and put it in the bank, his $1,000 would not grow the money supply by 10,000. It would be more like 1,190 altogether. So 1.19 times his 1,000. I hope I did my math right there. Let's see here, 1.19, that's our money multiplier, times his original $1,000 investment. Yay! So 1,190. So that would be the actual growth of the money supply. Our banks are much more conservative than your textbook simplified example. All right, so let's do some review questions. Banks in Hamsterville keep no excess reserves. The reserve requirement in Hamsterville is 10%. So remember, excess reserves are what they loan out. Reserve requirement is what they are required by law to keep. What is the money multiplier? I like these kind of questions because they give you information that is totally meaningless. So banks in Hamsterville keep no excess reserves. Okay, who cares? I mean, really, that has nothing to do with the money multiplier, right? The money multiplier is about how those excess reserves can grow the money supply, blah, 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 blah. But that's they're not asking us how much the money supply is growing. They didn't give us any numbers here, so we just need to, figure out what the money multiplier is. Well, the reserve requirement is 10%. That's all we need to know. Let's look back here at our equation, right? For every $1 divided by the reserve requirement will give us the money multiplier number, right? If you want to look at it this way, it's money multiplier is just for every $1 divided by the reserve ratio. So if the reserve requirement is 10%, well, for every $1, 1 divided by 0.1, yay, it's the exact same example from your book. So 1 divided by the reserve requirement, 1 divided by 10% by 0.1 is 10. Yay! That's a pretty easy one. Banks in Hamsterville have been required to keep 25% of all checkable deposits on reserve, but now the central bank has changed the reserve requirement to 10%. What immediate effect does this have on banks' balance sheets? This is part of the reason why this is the big reason why during the 2020 quarantine, the Federal Reserve decided to remove the required reserve amount, basically, because they are trying to encourage something here. All right. So why would they do this? Why would the banks, drop, or why would the government, essentially, whoever controls Hamsterville, drop the required reserve from 25% to 10? What's going to be the impact? Well, think about it. Do they have to keep as much money now? They were required to keep 25%, but now they only have to keep 10%, which means the required reserves go down, and that money then becomes excess reserves. Excess reserves are going to increase. So the banks now have more money on hand. What can they do with that money? Well, they can loan it out, right? And people can go get loans from the bank and start businesses and buy houses and do all that stuff that keeps the GDP growing and keeps the economy going. This is a good example of monetary policy, and we'll talk about that later. All right, a defining characteristic of fractional reserve banking. I'll give you a second to read these over because I know it's a bit long. Or you can always pause the video. But there's one gotcha question here. There's one possible close one. All right, now you may have said the requirement to keep a fraction of checking accounts in banks at a central bank. Okay, you don't keep your money at the Federal Reserve. You don't keep your money at the central bank. So while that is possible, that is not a necessary condition. However, required reserves and fractional reserve banking. So fractional reserve banking is the idea that all banks must keep. They don't keep all deposits on reserve. They keep parts of it on required reserve, but they don't keep all of it. So fractional reserve banking is the idea that banks don't keep all the money in the bank. They take it and they cut it into two chunks, excess and required, and they keep the required in their vaults, their own vaults, not necessarily a central bank vault, and then they loan out the excess. All right, another example. Mesa Verde Bank has $80,000 in demand deposits, $20,000 in bonds, and no owner equity. It has a reserve requirement of 5%. How much does Mesa Verde need to keep in required reserves? Now, think about this really closely here. So, think about the difference between a demand deposit and a bond. The bank owns $20,000 in bonds, and they have a liability right now of $80,000 in demand deposits. So really think about this. Which one of those two things, because it's not both, I'll tell you that right now. Which one of those two things do they have to keep required reserves of? The bank has bonds. They own these bonds, $20,000. But do they need to keep a required reserve amount of that money? That's just their cash. And actually right now it's not cash. It's illiquid. It's bonds. If they want to turn that into cash, they have to sell it. So right now that's an asset. They have $20,000 worth of bonds. but they're just kind of sitting there. All right. They have $80,000 in demand deposits. That's liability to the bank. That $80,000 people could come and ask for it. How much of that money do they need to keep? $4,000. So really think about it. How liquid are bonds, right? So those bonds don't actually interact with it at all. Once again, this is just kind of another question where they gave you loss leader. I don't know. Like they gave you a trick right there. They gave you that number, and a lot of you probably like, well, I had 80,000 or 20,000. No, 20,000. The bonds are just extra. That's a valued asset that the bank has. They're not loaning out bonds. You don't go to the bank and get a loan of a bond. That's not how that works. So the bank has $80,000 in liabilities right now. They have to keep 5% of $80,000. The $20,000 is irrelevant for this example. So hopefully that sort of makes sense. The reserve requirement times the demand deposits. So 5% times 80,000 is $4,000. All right. Now, if they turned those bonds into cash, if they sold those bonds, and then the bank had an extra $20,000 to spend, then things might be different. But we'll see. All right, the balance sheet of Cheaty's Bank is given below. Assume the reserve requirement is 20%. All right, so we know the reserve requirement is 20%, and we're looking at a bank T-chart here. Let's see, they have $30,000 in loans, bonds of $10,000, reserves of $20,000, deposits of $60,000. If you notice here, then their assets are $60,000, their liabilities are $60,000. Cool beans. If this bank sells all the bonds it holds to the central bank, how much does this bank have in excess reserves? Okay, so let's take a look. Right now, the bank, this T-chart here is maybe not as complete as the one that I gave you earlier when I was doing earlier examples. They didn't break their reserves into required and excess. They just say reserves. So guess what you have to do first? You have to be able to figure out the amount of required reserves here that they need to have, and then the amount of excess reserves they have left over. All right, so if they have $60,000 of liabilities, how much of this $60,000 do they need to keep as required reserves? Well, here, and pay attention because they gave you a different reserve requirement. The reserve requirement is 20%. So how much of that money do they need to keep reserved? All right, so 0.2, so 20% of 60,000. They need to keep $12,000 of required reserves right now. But how much of their reserves do they have? They have $20,000. How nice is this bank? They have more money than they actually need to keep for their legal requirement. They only need to keep $12,000, right? So they need to keep $12,000 of this 20 in order to have the required reserves currently for $60,000. So if you wanted to, if this is your test, you could then split that up and just write it in there, right? And you'll say required reserves is 12, excess reserves is, well, what's 20 minus 12? $8,000. So right now they have $8,000 of excess reserves currently that they could loan out again and add to their loans and add more loans and give out loans up to $8,000 currently. All right, not talking about anything with bonds here yet. Just saying that they have $12,000 they have to keep required, and they have $8,000 they can loan out. All right, if this bank sells all the bonds it holds to the central bank, how much does this bank have in excess reserves? Okay, well, right now, remember, the bonds are just an asset the bank has. But the bank owns $10,000 worth of bonds. They sell those. So let's say they get $10,000. All right, so the bank gets 10 grand now. Do they owe that $10,000 to anybody? Is it a liability for them? It's not. It's equity. It's money in their pockets, basically. So if that bank gets $10,000, they don't owe. Nobody has claims on that bank on that $10,000. So what's going to happen? Well, we said before that they had $8,000 in excess reserves. Well, now they just got how much more money? $10,000 more dollars. They just added $10,000 more dollars by selling those bonds. They don't owe that money to anybody either, so that's just $10,000 more dollars of excess reserves. So how much are their excess reserves currently now? Well, they had $8,000. They added $10,000. Hey, look, one of our options. $18,000. So if you want, pause the video, read over this. They're just explaining what I just tried to walk you through as well too. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, they now have $18,000 of excess reserves. All right. The balance sheet of Mutual Hamsterville, Bank of Mutual Hamsterville, is shown below. Man, this is so much stuff, and you're probably thinking, oh, I don't want to read all this. Oh, no. Okay, well, let's just skip down to the question first. How do excess reserves change if the central bank lowers the reserve requirement from 25% to 20? So much of this we can ignore. So much of this we can ignore. All right, so how do excess reserves change if the central bank lowers the reserve requirement from 25% to 20? Well, then all we need to do is, what do they have to keep a reserve requirement on at all, right? Do they need to keep a reserve requirement for their own owner's equity? No. They own that. That's their own money. That's $60,000 their own cash. That's not a liability. That is equity. That is, not something that it's somebody. They don't have to keep a certain amount of their own money set aside. They only have to keep a certain amount of, some other sucker's money set aside. So their liabilities here. So checkable, and this is why your book made a third column for equity. Usually you're going to see it like this. This is usually how the AP exam is going to be set up. So liabilities and equity be mushed together. So make sure you can know in your brain to separate those things. So they have checkable deposits of $100,000. That means that people have put $100,000 in this bank, and they need to keep a certain amount of it, required reserves, so the economy doesn't collapse and people don't run on the bank. Right now, they were at 25%. So 25%, they had to keep required reserves. Well, if they have, and this super simple numbers, right? If they had $100,000, well, how much do they have to keep? Okay, if you don't trust yourself here, but 0.25 times $100,000, $25,000. $25,000. So originally they had to keep $25,000 in reserves, which they were doing. Good for them. But now the central bank is lowering the reserve requirement from 25% to 20%. They want more money out there. They want more money out in that excess reserves. So they want to reduce the amount of required reserves. So we're going to go from 25% to 20%. Well, I'm not going to use the calculator anymore. You should be able to do this one in your head. If we needed to keep $25,000, but that was at 25%, and now we only need to keep 20%, well, what's the difference? How much do excess reserves change? If we lower the requirement amount, excess reserves are going to increase by $5,000. Hopefully this is making a bit of sense. Hopefully this one is not too complicated. All right, and that's where we're going to stop this pretty long video here. Well, next one we're going to do is walk through an actual FRQ from the AP exam.